I think this is a really interesting point, because one of the things that's been raised here was that, you know, anyone can go and have a kickabout in the park at football or, you know, go skiing, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be top players. No. But I think that with music, it's different. And I think this is an interesting point that you raise here, because on the one hand, anyone can go out and buy a guitar, but it's also an area where you don't actually have to be technically great. It's not something that really requires you to be the best guitarist in the world.
No.
I mean, how do you see it then? I mean, is it someone you go out and you decide to work with someone? What is it that you're actually looking for?
Well, for us, we just tend to look at these new bands, and I'm now at, you know, an age now where I can't, I suppose, judge new bands as well as I thought I could do maybe 15, 20 years ago. That's a fact, you know, because you grow older, you have the knowledge, you have a vision, you know about structuring things, you know about running things. But what stimulates, you know, kids nowadays is different. If it fully did excite me, then it maybe it is only chances that it's fully going to cross the board, you know. But there's a lot of young kids buying a lot of young music. You know, I listen to Radio 1 through just now, and I just don't quite get that excitement. I don't know if everyone else does or not, but I don't get that feeling of listening to it. I think, wow, this is fantastic, you know. I mean, there's about one pop song comes through that I hear every now and again. I sit and think, that sounds brilliant, you know. I can understand the success of that. But there's a lot of it out there just sounds, I'm going to sound like my parents, you know. I think some of it sounds as bloody same, you know. It doesn't have that definition to me that makes you get excited. And I'm hoping that comes back. But maybe, you know, youngsters hear that completely different, think, oh yes, it's completely different, you know. So I don't know about that side. And I'll admit that that's something that with the age you've got to accept, you know, that you're not always going to be, I say, but you can still run a business, you can still market something, you still know the ideas, you still know when you meet the folk whether you think they're a winner or not. Because you meet these folk personally and you sit there and you think, you know, this is a headache, or this is someone that's going to... And I always maintained as well that you're always better with a worker sometimes than a talent. We've had a lot of talented folk come through, but talented folk tend to go off the rails, get lazy. There's a talent that's come sometimes too easy to them, and they don't find they have to work at it. Oh, yeah, I can do that. It's easy, you know. And these folk aren't driven the same way. I think folk who are driven achieve a lot more in this business than the ones who are talented. That's my kind of...
And I mean, does that not then lead to the type of thing that you get on Radio 1? Is that not, if some people are just coming up, they're driven, but they're not necessarily making the most creative decisions?
Well, when you say about living in Scotland, you say that's the hardest bit just now, because the business has got really tight now. I mean, as a youngsters out here might not notice that because they won't experience what it was like before. But it's a lot tougher now than it was 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, it was probably a lot tougher than it was 20 years ago. You know, and that's the way it is. But I think, I don't know what the answer is to youngsters coming through, because they won't see that. You know, I always sort of told that story about Leor Cohen, who's, you know, an American exec in the music industry, once said to me the story of when he started off in the business, he was just full of enthusiasm. He was going to take on the world, you know. So he said, then by the time he'd been in it 20 years, he said, somebody switched the light on in the room. He says, and I saw the knives flashing, you know, I saw the holes in the ground, but I didn't see that when I was younger. And that's what gives them the enthusiasm to go on. That's what's in...
I mean, how have you found it in terms of it's one thing not connecting with Radio 1. I mean, I think that even people that are half our ages probably don't in this room. But the interesting thing is that there's obviously been massive shifts in the way the music business works, especially at record company level. And how have you found it as a manager adapting to that? I mean, I think one of the quote that I heard was that, 20 years ago, a manager had to know 5 things. Now a manager has to know everything. And there are so many different areas then that are constantly changing as well.
Well, I'll do this as quickly as I can, right? Just to give that logic of thinking behind it. The business is tough just now, so it's become more London-centric because there's a smaller group of people probably in more powerful positions now. For a while it was a bit more open and a lot of free-for-all used to go on. But now it's become a bit more cliquier. I see Radio 1, Radio 1's got such a tremendous strong foothold that, in the record industry bow down to them, which I think is a big mistake, so that most records we make now, we try and think, how do we get them on Radio 1? Now, that's a sad state to be in, when, bands will start making records thinking, oh, trying it on Radio 1, I'll try and get, Zane Lowe to like me, I'll try and get, so you're going out there and you're not being creative, you're being constructive, so you're playing a game to move on in the world. And that is where I think, in a way, that the British industry now is in a strange place. I can't, I'm sure, like Adele or not like Adele, phenomenal business, a straightforward record. She hasn't tried to please anyone in an art form, in a press form, or nothing. She's just made a song which has managed to touch other human beings. They have bought it, and it's worked. Now, there are other bands out there you could name, and again, I've never been in the business of looking at acts and saying, I love them, or I hate them, Any band out there now, starting off from scratch, from getting their equipment and sticking it in a car, or getting their dad to run them down somewhere, involves a great effort. All the people that I've met in this business, in music, musicians, I cannot think of any time where I have met I went through school, and I went through a kind of fairly tough school. There's a lot of kids at school who were not nice kids, and they were bad kids. You don't want to hang about, you don't want to see them, you dreaded bumping into them on the way home or something. It wasn't the most pleasant place. In that whole time I've worked in the music business, I haven't actually met any bad people. There's people who can be a bit of an idiot, they can be, something, but it's a fantastic crowd of folk, and it's quite encouraging to find folk who are driven and got a communal feeling together. They won't agree with each other. They'll slate each other because it's easier to slate folk than it is to compliment people because it's our nature. We're a sort of sad folk. We can't show our emotions very well. Scottish folk especially are not very good at showing that passion about something they love when it becomes another human being, So we're kind of strange that way. But cut all aside, I haven't met many folk that are bad folk in this way. And that's what encouraged me most about this business. And that's what I love about it so much. Even though I met folk here today, some folk I've never met before in my life, they were nice folk, and they were good folk, and they've got a communal interest, and they just want to make a living out of a job they love doing, and that's brilliant,
Did you mentioned the industry being London-centric, more London-centric now than before. I mean, that does surprise me. I mean, was there ever a time where you actually felt you had to move to London, or that maybe you could be doing more successful stuff if you actually were living in London?
I think there is, if you're in the constructive business of like trying to break a new band, you would now be very tempted to, once you get the style, if you were doing it by numbers, you would get the style of the music which you think is happening just now or about to come in there. I would probably move the band to London, which is I don't agree with, but I think you would do that. You would get to hang about the same places that, the people at Radio 1 or the press folk hang about. You would sometimes be judged. You are quite often judged by the company you keep in life, So you'd be forced to hang around with what you'd see as the right company, and you'd hope that would open enough doors to give you a chance of moving in there. Now that would be making music by, like painting by numbers. But there is another side of it which I think is the more rewarding side if you get it right. And it's just you do what you do. And you do it with 100% belief. And you don't become too calculated about it. And that, I think, leaves you standing there as being a proper product rather than being a Mark II, a Mark III, or, you know, it's just, it doesn't excite me so much playing that game, because that game, you could play that game and you know.
Did you, I mean, was there a point though where you felt maybe that you should be in London, or that you felt any kind of pressure, or that you felt you were at a disadvantage being in Glasgow?
Not at that time. I would say today, for instance, I think being in London probably is better than being in Glasgow, right? And I wouldn't like to feel a bit that, but I think that there is a sense of that just now. I think it's quite hard that I don't know how to explain that without sounding as though it's a kind of sour grapes type thing, but I think the press is very much generated from a London base. It always has been, but it would look to Manchester, look to Liverpool, Glasgow. It always had its wee run rounds, but because business is so tight and things now, they've gone safe. Everything's gone a bit safe, and we're probably in slightly small, protected cliques now. We'll develop more and more now because of that. And listen, we might be guilty of that ourselves. You know, in Glasgow, I might pull on the folk I know well enough to make sure we're all still linked in. We can help each other. You know, I don't know.
Okay, so I mean, when you've over the years you've worked with a lot of different artists, and how have you been? You know, have you been surprised by what you see on stage in comparison to what you see off stage? I'm not sure what you mean, but I mean, I've got to see bands nowadays, and I think the standard's phenomenal nowadays. I mean, whether that's more folk playing guitar, or more folk singing, more folk doing things, I think the standard has jumped up. For a while, I thought the standard went down a wee bit, but now it's moved up. There's some pretty impressive stuff. I suppose, I mean, more on a sort of personal level. I mean, you were saying earlier on that you'd had some folk that weren't the best people to work with, and other people that. I mean, I guess maybe you should talk about, Primal Scream in particular, because the idea that anyone could manage them is, amazes me. But you seem to have managed it. Yeah?
Oh, I'll tell you this quickly, but I mean, a lot of Primal Scream is probably, the stories are probably worse than they are. They are not. I find them the most pleasant band in the world. They're great people. They are incredibly focused, and they know exactly what they want. And that's one of the most important things out there. They don't need to be told anything. They make records. I mean, you see about giving a little record. Sometimes Bobby once said to me, "I think we make great records. We don't make enough hits." And I think that's probably sums them up. Now he says, we don't write songs to become hits. We just sometimes stumble on them and they become. And I think that's what they do. And, they've been going 25 years, So it's fantastic that, they can keep doing that.
How did they come about? I mean, how did you end up working with them if you'd been...
Well, we took them on at a time where the accounting guy had taken a load of money off them. They hadn't a clue about. They're not any form of breadheads. They just work and they get what they get. They didn't realise where their money was until the Inland Revenue had hit them with a bill for like £300,000. Then they realised they didn't have any money in the bank. They fell out with the accountant guy. They fell out with the manager because the manager should have taken touch with that. And they only had Al McGee left in the label, who wasn't in a position to advance them that money just to clear the tax thing, So Alan had phoned us up and asked us would we be interested in looking after them. And if you've heard this story before, it's just I apologise for telling it twice, but I remember Jerry, my business partner, said to me, you know, Alan wants to see if we'd look after Primal Scream. And my immediately thought was, why take on the headache? You know, we had a few bands that were doing well. And Jerry said, oh, you know, I know Bobby. He used to be a roadie for Altered Images in the way back, you know. And I said, well, listen, we'll go down and meet them. So we went down to meet them. We sat down with Bobby, Andrew, Manny, and Robert Young, Throb at the time. And we had a chat for about an hour, and I asked them loads of questions about, you know, they didn't know who the merchandiser was. They didn't really know what you know, who handled the royalty statements. And you know, it was all that stuff. They hadn't a clue of any of that stuff. They just let it go. And they seemed like such nice guys. And even the point, I remember at one point I was talking, it was really hard, and I would say I must have got to the boring stage, which is probably what you're thinking just now, is that I was going on so many questions to them that they didn't really know the answers to. And I was reading my list I was going to go through, and I looked up and all four of them were looking across the road, and it was all because this really pretty girl was walking down the road, and they were too busy watching the girl walking down the road rather than worrying about their career. And that's Primal Scream. They just they are a rock and roll band in the true sense of the word. They don't think of monies and things like that. So I said to them, because of the position I'm in, I said, for the next 3 months I'll work and sort all your money stuff out for you. I said, because it's something I can do. It's not too hard to do, and I can do that. And I'll meet up with accountants, the new accountants, and we put all the stuff together. And of course, 15 years later, you know.
It's been 15 years.
Well, 14 years, yeah.
And I mean, is there, when you as a manager, on the one hand, you're taking care of the business side of things. To what extent do you actually have to take care of the personal side of things? I mean, where do you have a line, or do you have to actually sometimes pull people aside and say you're taking too many drugs, or you're doing this, you should maybe cut down on that? I mean, is it something you don't get involved in?
Oh no, we sat down with them at a time when we first took them on. It is Primal Scream, you've got to remember. It's just, so I remember meeting folk after we took them on at first, you know, people would say, oh, what's it like managing a bunch of junkies, you know? I said, listen, you know, and I got angry at that because they're not a bunch of junkies, you know? And I remember sitting down even with Bobby sometimes, you know, and sometimes he was in a bad way, you know, and we'd one of them was in rehab when we took them on, and the other one was in hospital because he was so drunk he fell off a fountain in France and broke his leg so badly that the next 2 or 3 days were judging whether it had to be amputated or not. So they were in a bad way, and I remember sitting even, and Andy Weatherall, who's a close friend of theirs, you know, and he still says to me, he says, I still quote that saying. I said, well, you know what? If you don't work hard at this and get to it, you'll be driving a taxi when you're 50. And I think, you know, and Andy Weatherall says, that's always driven me on that line, you know. And I said, well, it's not anything wrong with being a driving a taxi at 50, but you have got the ability to move on, and it's not that hard. But the drug thing is a big problem, you know, and it's, we would have 50% of the gigs were good, 50% were atrocious. So we systematically, they admitted they wanted to stop that situation in life and not want to be like that. But that's the same as people say on a Sunday morning after a Saturday night out, you know, never again, you know, and then Sunday night they're out again. You know, it's just, there's a slight human nature. But they genuinely said, well, listen, if you want to do it, we systematically changed all the crew. We changed all the folk that they hung around with. So that it took the environment a bit different, because my argument was to all of them, you know, you wake up in the morning, you're at home with your girlfriend and kids. Do you take drugs then? And they said, no. I said, well, what difference is it, you know, then and 8 hours later? You know, and it's because it's the environment that creates that, you know, and so they slowly, and remarkable, now, not talking about anyone's personal life here, but, you know, they are pretty damn clean now, you know, and they understand the focus. Who's to say if it will continue or not? I don't know. But at this point in time, and they're very happy with it, and now they can be very open about their rock and roll lifestyle without feeling embarrassed about it. You know, it's just a phase, you know, a time, and you know they're getting up to 50 now. You know, so there is a
time to stop.
Time to move on. You know, but I this was going to say, you know, because I know the time's sneaking on and things just now, but I'm quite happy to answer.
That's what I was going to say. Does anyone have any questions? I can't actually see, so whoever's got the microphone, if you can look. Is there a hand up anywhere? No one got. Yes, there's Eric.
Hello. Oh, that's awesome. I'm sure there's a lot of artists and performers in here, and I'm just interested to know, when should an artist, performer, band get a manager, and or when shouldn't they get a manager?
I don't think there's any hard, fast rules for that, to be honest. I mean, bands are formed. I always say to folk, when they're forming, and A&R folk used to say is a standard excuse to bands, they would take in the CD, they'd play it in an A&R to an A&R guy, and the guy would not want to be rude. Sometimes he'd be rude, or sometimes he says, you know what, there's something good, you know, you really want to get a manager involved to take this forward, you know, which is a polite way usually of saying, I'm not bursting about this, I don't hate it, but I'm not going to do anything about it. But it's usually a sort of polite way. And then the band will come out, so we saw somebody at Epic, and they said we should get a manager. You know, they liked it, and you know, it starts to move forward from there. I think sometimes they're natural. You know, sometimes there are people in a crowd who become natural managers. There might be a friend, there might be someone you trust. As long as they believe in it. And if you've got something that's really good, believe you me, a manager is not necessary at the early stage. Bands who've got something that's really good and moves on there, I always think if the phone rings, you're doing something right. When the phone doesn't ring, you're not doing it right. And now whether people sometimes don't want to talk to bands about something because it's personal to them. So managers are a great buffer, you know. If there's something there but someone wants to discuss how they talk to it, yes, it's very hard to do that to a band. At that point, you do need a manager, I think, who then can act as some kind of mediator and hope he keeps the peace. I know that's not the perfect answer or something, because I don't think there is a perfect answer to that. I think if bands that are creative and they've got the idea and they move forward, things start to evolve for them, I think.
Anyone else got a question? Don't be shy. We get the opportunity too often. I mean, I think what interests me is, you know, if you could still, do you think you'll still be managing in 10 years' time? I mean, is that something that, you know, do you still have that same enthusiasm? You know, you're saying sometimes you get up and you're in a good mood like anyone else. Other times you're just like, shit, you know, why aren't they getting this? I mean, do you still have the same joy for the music and the same enthusiasm about what you're actually listening to?
Well, you've got to be honest. When it's great, it's fantastic. You know, it's a great feeling. I sort of do. I mean, I see that my wife who's here tonight probably understands me more than anyone. And I'm a bit of a workaholic. Always have been. So I do drive myself quite hard to go on all the time. So I don't know. I sometimes say, oh, you know, maybe I should stop and let. We've got 2 young kids in the office now. We're bringing through as young managers. And I think they're brilliant, you know. And every day I try and put more and more onto them. And they enjoy getting more and more onto them, you know. And they're starting to make decisions. And so I'm hoping that eventually they will become, you know, they'll have sucked me dry from any knowledge I've got. And they will have that, and hopefully they'll have it at a young age, and they'll be able to move forward with that. And that'll be a great feeling, I think, you know. So I don't feel as though I've got to be there, and I don't think I'm probably necessary as much as it was in the past. But the fact that I watch these young groups of people, some young bands are 17, 18, and these kids are like 21, 22, and I think that's the future. You know, I really do.
So you reckon you could actually just see yourself retiring and taking it easy? Yeah? Oh,
I don't know. I probably still want to keep my finger in the pie, I suppose. But I don't know. As I say, I still enjoy it. I still wake up in the morning. Some days just can't wait to get to it and get into it. There's a great bunch of folk, even folk I've known for a long time. Some folk that are in this room I've known, and I've got to say as well that Bruce, who's sitting up there, is the godfather. You know, I mean, Bruce is the reason we are in business today. You know, it's like anyone in Scotland who opens up something and gets it off the ground. Likewise, I feel the same for Stuart Columbus, you know, who got something from a level of a small club to T in the Park. You know, he had that vision of, and do you know what? That's what it takes. It's having a vision to think, this is where I'm going. This is where I'm going to be. It's not a case I'm going to sell out the Captain's Rest. I'm going to sell out, you know, the Grand Ole Opry or something like that. You know, you've got to think, I am going the whole way. You know, but you know, you've got to have the.
So what would you say? I mean, what do you think is the kind of at the core of being a successful manager? Are there any particular traits that you need to embody?
I think the first one is you've got to get lucky with the band. And of course, you make your own luck sometimes. You know, if you go out looking for bands, there's a good chance you'll see one. You know, you're hoping for one that's going to phone you up and walk through the door. 9 times the ones that phone you up to walk through the door have been knocked back by about 5 or 6 folk. Now, that's me being cynical, you know, because you wonder, so you always feel, like anything in life, you feel more reward when you go out and find something than you do if something comes. You know, if a salesman comes to your door, you're liable not to buy from him. But you go into a shop, which you've cursed went to go to, and you're more liable to buy more. So when you get looking for something, you have that hunger in you to start with. So you've got the first initial stage of moving forward. That's my logic.
Great. Well, I think that we're going to have to start getting everyone out here in the next 10 minutes or something like that. But Rab, thanks very much for coming through.
Thank you.
It's really nice.